Hello, this is Chewing the Gristle, and this is Al Black with Tim Conroy, and our special guest today is Bill Neumire. Bill has published two chapbooks, Resonance of Kin with Pudding House in 2003, and Between Worlds, Foothills Publishing, 2003. His first full-length collection, Etris, Kelsey Books, 2013, was a semifinalist for the 42 Miles Press Award, and his upcoming second book, hashtag The New Crusade, will be out in early 2022 from Unsolicited Press. His poems have appeared in a number of venues, including the Harvard Review, Los Angeles Review, West Branch, Beloit Poetry Journal, and the Laurel Review. He also has two poem films co-created with filmmakers Amiro Mo and Avi Chatri through the Visible Poetry Project. He reviews books of contemporary poetry for Valium and for Verdad, where he serves as poetry editor. Welcome, Bill.
Thank you, Al. Appreciate the intro.
Tell us about your poetry journey and education. And did you write in high school and college? And or did you have someone who encouraged you early on to write your poetry?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think my grandparents watched me quite a bit when I was young, and I think that is always terrific for kids when it's a possibility, because grandparents have this distance, in time from kids, and it allows them to convey a different kind of pace of life. So, when I was at my grandparents' house and I was younger, we would play piano, we would go outside. I remember there was this old abandoned well in their yard. They had this huge yard that I could just sort of freely explore. There's not the fast-paced energy of having a working parent right next to you all the time. So I got to do a lot of exploring independently outside. I got to talk to my grandparents, who obviously lived through a lot of things my parents couldn't even tell me about. And that's when I really started writing, just as a kid, like little silly things that I didn't really realize till I got into adulthood was a kind of beginning for me. And then I didn't think too much about it until high school. High school was interesting for me as a writer because I would have been sort of embarrassed and aghast to have been called a poet or writer for a long time in high school. And, I was a jock. I had letters in 5 varsity sports, and that was not the crowd I was running with. But I think I read some James Wright probably for, English class or something. And it was a great sort of opening up of, first of all, men and boys are allowed to write poetry, which is a deeply ironic thing because, most of the canon of English poetry was dominated by men for unfortunate reasons forever. But I still had this idea that it was not for men. And James Wright really opened that door initially for me, probably like junior year-ish. And then I wrote, stuff just for myself. I wrote like journal stuff. I write like funny things, making fun of people in the high school. And still didn't think about it in any kind of serious way, but I'll tell you what I enjoyed. I enjoyed that I could tell even my English teachers didn't get it. And, as a egotistical high school kid, that was kind of a fun experience that like I understood and had tapped into something that even my teacher didn't understand completely. And then going into college, I actually went to college at a small state school for political science. But on a whim, because I needed an elective, I took a creative writing course, and there was a fantastic poet named Judith Kitchen, who was a poet and essayist. And she just, again, sort of like the James Wright experience, just opened up my whole world. She, I immediately switched to creative writing after her class. And I walked in this sort of arrogant, I had a fraternity jacket on. I clearly had no interest in being called on. But she was an unbelievable human being and teacher, because she knew some stuff about me ahead of time. And I remember distinctly she passed out these poems without the author's names on them. And we're reading them in class, and she called on me and said, "Who wrote this?" And I said, "I don't know, there's no name on it." And she's like, "No, but I mean, you read the poem, who wrote this?" I sort of started getting belligerently like, "I told you, I don't know." And she was like, "Yes, you do. Who wrote this?" So I said, "All right, fine. It's a Sylvia Plath poem." And she said, "Yeah, it is." And then after class, she pulled me aside and she said, "I didn't do that to pick on you. I did that because I knew you knew the answer." And that was the kind of like thing that was quintessential to her. Like, she just knew how to get to the core of a person immediately. And that's what poetry does, I think, when it's successful. And she, changed my journey for sure. So I switched to creative writing at that point, and finished undergrad with a couple other brilliant professors. Stan Rubin was her husband, and he and I are still good friends. They actually moved out to Washington State and started the Rainier Writers Workshop eventually. And after undergrad school, I sort of had a difficult decision to make about going that road of MFA, PhD, or not. And that is not an easy road to go. And I knew I wanted a family, so I opted not to go that road. But I've always, I guess one of the things I would tell emerging writers is that that's one of the great things about writing is you don't need to be a writer as a job to just always be a writer. Like, it's a lifestyle choice, not a career choice. So at the end of undergrad school, I got a terrific internship on a whim with the Cortland Review. There were some fantastic people there that had me start writing reviews of contemporary poetry books. And that was another great experience that has lasted ever since. I've been doing that for 20 years. And kept me tapped into the world of poets and writers, and just meeting new people, finding new books, figuring out what other people were doing so I could test out, is what I'm doing different? Am I copying something? Is what I'm doing boring compared to these other people? I think that's the basic layout. And ever since then, I've been doing those things. I've been reviewing poetry books, writing on my own, finding experiences like this that, just pop up as they do. And that's where I am today.
Man, there's so many questions I want to ask you about,
Sure.
That aspect of reviewing poetry books. But before we get to that, or any of the other questions, read a couple poems and let's lay the groundwork for your poetry.
Sounds great. So the first poem I'll read is in my upcoming book, the New Crusades. And it's a prose poem called I Don't Believe in Ghosts. Let's say you were ready for bed in your brown-rimmed glasses with your dark black yoga pants and your loose green sweatshirt. For you, I would shovel the driveway in the dark, the unsolvable ice under the curdled snow, and I would scrape your windshield and warm your car. I am trying so hard to explain myself. I am trying so hard to avoid words like love, as if they were long clouds ruining safe flights over America's midriff. I am trying not to put you in the usual gardens. The important thing is you were always quiet about matters like this, always willing to let certain phenomenon be observed only. I'm fond of the scar on your ass where they took that mole. There are times I put your shirts away and feel how light you are.
It's a gorgeous poem.
I appreciate it. My wife actually, when she found out about that poem, she got really mad. She's like, "You put that out in the world, so you can't do that." But we've reconciled since. So this second poem is from my first book, Estrus, and it's very much, Estrus is, this idea of like mating season in animals where they have this urge to be drawn together for procreation, but the book draws on that just as the basic idea of, we all have this urge for community, for relationship, for intimacy, for finding each other. This poem is called The Great Tiredness, and a lot of the poems in this book connect to my father, who's still alive, was a great person, and worked at a salt factory for 40 years. The Great Tiredness. It started at dusk when the paper factory announced it would run all night, every night. No lunch breaks, no windows, no crying in the salt-rusted parking lot before dawn. That was 30 years ago. My father, who mistrusted every pay raise and handshake, whose steel-toed boots were stained with white lips from the snow. I'm in his old mind now. His gloved heart I can feel at the bottom of me, like it's a coin at the bottom of the reservoir we used to trespass. There's a whirring in us, the sound an antique engine makes when it's not worth fixing. The bones hardly hold the sagging musculature. The car in the dark? A snowflake trying to survive the fall. It's here now, the great snow, the lake freezing over, banks busy with debt, the quiet burl of heart coughing to a silence. What happens when the body abandons the mind? Betterment? It is the hour of married peers, of firefly lights reaching each other. The body wakes, pushes itself from bed, covers itself in cloth, moves to stay relevant.
What grabs you about a good poem, and what makes you say, man, this is almost a good poem? Kind of help us understand that process.
Sure. One of the things I love to do with my students, even, I teach high school literature and writing right now, and one of the things I love starting with and talking about poetry is just that effort of defining what is a poem. And, they inevitably fail because I think we probably all fail in that effort to define what is a poem, because it's a question and retort that goes something like this. They'll say something like, well, it's emotional language. And I'll say, okay, well, I think a fiction writer would probably be pretty upset if you said their work wasn't emotional language. Or they'll say, it's short. And I'll say, well, the Iliad and the Odyssey aren't terribly short. Paradise Lost isn't terribly short. And they'll say, okay, well, it's about conveying an emotional experience. And, it's not like a story. And I'll say, again, I could point you to a lot of poems that are definitely just long stories. They'll say, okay, well, it's about line breaks. And I'll say, well, have you heard of this thing called prose poetry? And, so it's this impossible effort to pin down what is a poem. And I think what it comes down to for me in the end is that poetry prioritizes sound in a way that prose doesn't. So it's not that prose doesn't pay any attention to sound, but that's the priority for poetry. Even if it's a narrative poem, even if it's a prose poem. And I think that's part of the answer to that question, Tim, is for me, it has to do something sound-wise that impacts me in a way that doesn't make me think, oh, I've seen this before. It makes me think, ooh, that was a new sound experience that I haven't felt before. And I think as far as the poem that is almost there or, is not quite there, even if it has some good qualities, it's the consistency of that experience that is the biggest trigger for me. Is it working on that sound level sometimes, but not always? Or is the setup of that big sound experience, that big poetic experience, not right to set up that great moment and needs something different? And then, I think we could argue a lot about what is a poem in terms of some people will talk about metrics and it has to be some sort of metered rhymed pattern thing. But for me, the biggest two items are that sound piece. And Ashbery said something along the lines, I'm paraphrasing here, about a poem has to include surprise. So if I'm not surprised in some way when I read a poem, it's not a successful poem to me. And that can mean common things like cliches, like you're literally just using boring, overused language, or you just haven't done, even if I couldn't point to something and say that's wrong, you haven't done anything to surprise me in the poem. You haven't done anything to make me think, oh, I didn't see that coming. So I think those are the two big things that I look for. Some sort of sound experience that I couldn't get in prose and that is consistent in some way or set up well and delivered in some way. And then I want to be surprised. I don't want to read something that I feel like I've probably read 1,000 times before.
Well, let me ask you about your own personal process for writing a poem. It's hard. It's hard to write a poem. It's hard to find the time. It's hard to find the time when you have children.
Yeah.
So how do you do it? What's your process?
It was a lot easier when I was younger. So yes, I have a 6-year-old and 9-year-old right now. I'm happily married with a great family, and I work as a teacher full time. I have a lot of other sort of things I enjoy doing. I still enjoy sports. The time is extremely limited. When I was younger, I would just literally, in college, I discovered the college library, and that was huge to me. I was like, holy crap, this place is open 24 hours a day. I can lay on a couch in the basement and nobody will see me for 48 hours. So I did exactly that. I would just, I'd spend days just burying myself reading all of someone's work that I liked, or, the state college I went to, SUNY Brockport, had a fantastic, even at that time, I started college in 1998. They had this fantastic VHS collection of interviews with poets, and I'd watch those over and over again. So it's sort of like this. Thankfully, that foundation makes my lack of time now easier because I can draw on all that stuff. I've got a ton of writing, that I can go back to. I know more about what I want to look for and how to look for things to draw from for inspiration now. But as far as trying to make it happen these days, a lot of it happens after 8:30 when my kids go to bed. A lot of it happens when, I find these small times during the day, doctor's offices, stuff like that, where even in the car, this is probably how I will end up on my epitaph. Even in the car, I've got a notebook, and if I can find time at a stoplight or something, more dangerously when it's not at a stoplight, I'll still jot things down. I love poetry podcasts, so I'll listen to those on my commute to work, songs, stuff like that. I'm always jotting things down. I think probably because of the phase of life I'm in now, there's a lot of jotting down that happens, and then there's these golden time zones, after my kids go to bed for a couple hours, where I can process that jotting down into poems. But I definitely write less now than I did when I was younger for those reasons.
Hey, Bill, how do you decide once you have decided on your concept of a poem and the idea of the poem, and you even have your lines of a poem, how do you decide your poem's form, your physical form on the page?
That's a good question. So I think part of it goes back to that idea of surprise. I am a very restless poet formally. I get bored of form very quickly. I get bored of just about anything very quickly, honestly. So I'm constantly testing. This poem, I Don't Believe in Ghosts, it actually has those slash marks in it to mark line breaks, those vergules. There's a poet I love named Ben Lerner who talked a lot about that idea that this poem is this effort to come up with an ideal language that we'll always fail at. It will never be ideal. And he actually talked at one point about a prose poem with slash marks for line breaks as being more of a blueprint for a poem than a poem itself. And I thought that was such an interesting idea that I decided to try it out. But this poem actually started with line breaks. And I like doing that. I like saying, okay, if I put it out as a prose poem, if I put it out with line breaks, if I put it out with crazy indentation and spacing all over the page, and then I try to read it out loud and I try to look at it and ask myself, how does it fit with what's going on? That's usually where I come to with form. And so, for example, this I Don't Believe in Ghosts poem, to me, in the end, felt like such a sort of simple declaration of feeling that I thought it didn't make sense to make it anything but a simple paragraph. You know, the kind of thing that if you actually gave it to someone you loved who you were talking to, they'd be like, oh, I get this, it's a paragraph. Like, you know, as opposed to like trying to figure out what the line breaks meant or the weird spacing meant. But then there are other times where what I'm doing is just more mentally playful. And then I think I start playing with, okay, what if I space this phrase way over to the right and you have to take a long visual pause of white space to get to the next thing? What if I use that white space instead of periods and commas to create a pause? And that's just playfulness, you know? So when I feel like the poem is more playful, that's when I start doing weirder things.
Well, how about playing with a few more poems and read a couple more for us, and then Al will follow up with a couple questions.
Sure, sounds great. Okay, so this poem is from the upcoming book, # The New Crusades, and a lot of the poems in that book are these epistolary poems where I'm talking to the American evening. And the book, you know, has a lot to do with ideas about masculinity in our current moment. It's got a lot to do with complicated things going on in the country. So there are these poems that address the American evening. This like time, like I said, I process things around 8:30 at night. This time where you can sort of absorb what just happened and digest it and speak back to this abstract night. So this poem is called Dear Curtained American Evening at the Cliff of Spring. The CIA reads 5 million tweets a day. Do you have such mirrors? Does the sea do to you what it does to me, or the current resident? Lake view, gloom, distant fire pit, moored boats translate fiercely all night. We are here forever. Help me, the floating bottle said anonymously. Do you pray? Have you changed your mind? Help me help myself, all for a value you won't find anywhere else. Certain architecture, first edition, the returned voice of a dead singer. Why do you give such hints all along? Can I grow toward you? Can we listen to time together? There are castles still with restaurants where 1,000 lobsters die. Dear, familiarize yourself with the nearest fire exit. Do you see us if you are us? I go back and forth a little bit again. This poem is from the first book, Estrus, and it's called The Worst Buddhist. Some nights, a wild dog scratches a circle and lies down at the edge of the yard. Everyone knows he's killed the missing cat. He'll do it again. I once read an introduction to Buddhism to cure my mind. In the slantways snow, I made lists of facts. Hummingbirds weigh less than an ounce. The dog wakes, rushes toward the wood. Then it realizes which world it's in and lies down again. I've built such towers to house my doubt. I write love stories that aren't really love stories. Vultures will eat so much they can't take off, you know. And this dog in the snow, it's got mange and fleas and blood in its ears. I'm the worst Buddhist because I want something out of everything. Even this dog I want to fit into the story. I try to picture myself before this was so. Strange animals appear in this vision. So there's one from each of the books again. And that first book, I definitely played with animals a lot. I really love animals as a sort of poetic figure because they don't talk. So like you can have a conversation with a dog, and it really just forces you to have a conversation with yourself, which I find fascinating.
Well, my dad's dog talked to him.
That's fair. That's fair.
So, revision. How much revision do you do, and when do you know that your revision is done? When do you know that the poem is finished?
Well, let me do this backwards, and I'll answer that second piece first, because I think to me, I know a lot of people have the answer that basically revision's never done, and I totally understand that. But in the reality of our finite time here on Earth, to me, revision is done when I start playing with a poem in a way that I can tell makes it worse. And obviously that's a bit intuitive. For me, that's something I start to experience where I'm playing with it too much and I realize I'm just trying to make a good thing better here, and it's actually making it worse. So that's my answer to the when do I know it's done. Again, it's very intuitive. As far as what my revision process looks like, because I jot a lot of things down and then sort of process post, I end up with a lot of half poems, a lot of quarter poems, and honestly, my most productive revision is usually in the combining of those pieces. So, I have a whole document I just call pile, and it's just this pile of like quarter poems, half poems, and sometimes I'll take time every couple months to print that out and just sort of start adding different ones together and see if they make sense together. And sometimes I have a poem that is close to done, but it's not there yet, and I'll start taking those pieces and saying, okay, can something here finish this poem? Even if it goes in the middle somewhere, even if it just is 2 lines that triggers me to rewrite the ending somehow. And that's my general revision process, unless I get super lucky, which happens, I hope, to most writers sometimes, where you just you bang one out and you're like, that's that. And I usually still like to let that sit for a little while to go back and make sure that's that, but that happens sometimes.
Who are you reading now, as far as poetry?
Ooh, poetry is a super social experience for me. I don't know if it's that we're in a moment where a lot of people feel more comfortable talking about being introverts, talking about depression, things like that, or if there actually is an increase in those mentalities. But sometimes I feel very different in the poetry world because I am incredibly extroverted, and like I told my wife, like, if I could just pass out in a pile of like dogs and friends every night, that would be how I would live life. So a lot of my reading comes from socialization, and if I find a new writing group, I'm reading all of their books as quickly as possible. So I had a fantastic writing group years ago when online writing groups were first sort of getting started. There was this place called the Alsup Review that had a group of writers that worked together, and then when that ended, I started reading a lot of their work. So I'm still good friends with a poet named Hannah Craig, whose work I read a lot, and the most recent iteration of that is I started a writing group that turned me on to new poet Sandra Simons. I read all of her stuff recently. I really, like I said, I love Ben Lerner's work. I'll go back to his stuff. I'll go back to James Wright. I just read Chen Chen's book. I have this impulse. I think it's just a stubborn, ornery thing where if something is getting a lot of attention, like Jericho Brown's book Tradition just won the Pulitzer, I'm going to read that, but I'm going to wait 2 years. So it's just an ornery disposition of mine that if something's already getting attention, I don't want to read it in that moment. I'll read it, but not till later. So like Chen Chen's book, for example, Ocean Vuong's book, I'm just coming to now, even though they got a lot of attention a little while back. Those are fantastic books. I just read Rick Barrett, who's a poet out in Washington who I love a lot. I just read and reviewed his book and Dora Malik's book. I love their stuff. They're, two very different poets, but through reviews, I come to a lot of stuff that I'll read. Even if I don't end up reviewing it, I get a lot of books that I read, and I'm like, I don't think I could forge a review of this, but I really enjoy it. Yeah, I think that's a lot of what I'm reading now. Like I said, it's such a social experience for me that what I actually end up reading a lot of times is whatever group of friends and people I'm meeting online and workshopping with, I'm finding their books as quickly as possible and gobbling them up.
Yeah, I think Rick Barrett's book, was it Galleons or something
Yep.
like that? It's a really interesting, fascinating book. It's really good. But you gave me some people to check out. Wanted to ask you how, now before we dig into the craft question a little bit, how is poetry like basketball?
Whew. That's a great question. So yeah, I coach middle school basketball, boys basketball, and I played basketball all my life. I still enjoy playing for fun. How is poetry like basketball? I think that when you are, so there's two different ways to think about this, I guess, reading poetry and writing poetry. As far as writing goes, I think there is very much a sense that when you're playing basketball or any sport well, you're not thinking about it at a sort of conscious level, because when you start thinking about it, you're going to perform poorly. And athletes will talk about being in the zone, quote unquote, which is just like your body is operating on muscle memory and instinct, and that's all you need to be an incredible athlete. Your body just knows how to move, how to react to what's coming at you. You've done a lot of things to prepare for being in a position to do that. And it's not that you don't think at all like, oh, I see there's only 30 seconds on the clock type of thing. But as far as your reactions to what's happening on the court, it's very intuitive, very, I can't be consciously thinking about how I'm going to dribble the ball, where I'm going to go on the court. And I think writing poetry is very much like that. If you're doing it successfully, you've done a lot of work to prepare. You've read a lot, you've practiced a lot of different types of writing. But when you're in the moment of a poem, if you're thinking about it, it's probably going to be terrible. If you're just sort of instinctually feeling your way through it, you're probably going to end up with a much better product. As far as reading poetry goes, I think, if you go to poetry, if you go to any writing, especially poetry though, thinking about ideas of career and success and publishing, you're probably going to fail. It doesn't mean that those things can't happen, but that can't be why you go to it. You have to go to it just like basketball for sheer pleasure, because you enjoy that experience of talking to yourself through writing for a while, of learning about yourself as a human being and how communication with yourself and with others deepens our experience of life. And I feel like basketball, as lofty as that sounds for basketball, I mean, I feel like it's the same thing for sport, that the people I know who truly love the sports they play, whether they're gifted at them or not, it deepens their experience of life. It's something you go to not for, I'm going to have a 16-0 record. It's something you go to for pleasure, and that you would just play with anyone at any time because you just instinctually love that experience.
Hey, Bill, that was an oddball question I asked, and you answered it beautifully. That's great stuff. In terms of craft, what are the poetic elements you tend to sort of lean on? If you tend to kind of go back to more.
Yeah, I'll be honest. I've studied meter and traditional forms all my life, but I don't enjoy them and I'm not good at them. So it's not those. I like image quite a bit, and I like juxtaposition quite a bit. So I like taking images and putting them next to other images. My daughter's peeking on us in the background. Image, juxtaposition, I like surprise, like I said, and I think that is a device. I think the idea of actively asking yourself, okay, I just wrote this line, what works next but would not be expected next? So that idea of irony, juxtaposition, and surprise, I think, are all elements I like to work with. And formally, I like to work with, that first book was a lot of very sort of simple lyric poems, and I like to work with moving against whatever I've just done out of boredom. So I like to work with the idea of these new epistolary poems that are broken all over the page. I've got poems in the new book that are sort of like 3 columns that you can read across, or you can read each column up and down, and they should still make some sense. So I like working formally with stuff typographically you'd see on the page. Those are some answers to that question.
No, that's great. Brother Al.
Yeah. As a poet, you're also a reviewer. How did you get into being a poetry reviewer? And also, when you're reviewing a collection, I know Tim was asking how you know when it's a good poem or when it's almost a good poem, but how do you get into this process of reviewing?
So, like I said, when I was at the end of college, I actually went and studied abroad in Ghana my senior year, and I had this weird half semester thing when I got back where I didn't need to take any particular classes, but I needed some credits. So I could take whatever I wanted, which was this fantastic little experience. So I went to Ralph Black, who's another fantastic poet, and he was my advisor at the time, and I said, can I do some different stuff where I don't have to like report to a classroom? And he said, yeah, let's figure something out. So I had an independent study where literally I'd just go into his office, I'd take a book off the shelf, I'd read it, and we'd talk about it. And then he helped me find this magazine, the Cortland Review, which was an online magazine at the time, still a great magazine. They took me on initially to do some sort of, secretarial type stuff, to get to know the magazine. And then eventually they let me start trying my hand at reviewing poems, because I think a literary magazine can be many things, but the idea of including critical work like book reviews alongside creative work, I think really deepens the process. And that was a great experience. So my experience has evolved. But Judith Kitchen, who I talked about earlier, was a fantastic reviewer of poetry books, and she talked to me about trying to identify for yourself in your discussion, who's the speaker in the book, what are the major tones, and what are the major devices. So I try to touch on those things, and then attitudinally, I don't really want to judge a book in a review so much as I want to convey to the person reading the review, this is what I think the poet is trying to do, and here are a bunch of excerpts, so you can judge for yourself if you think they're successful or not. So I try not to, either on the positive or the negative, completely tout a book or completely tear down a book. I try more to say to myself, as a reader of poetry for years, this is what I think they're doing, and here's enough of straight excerpts for you to get a taste and ask yourself, yeah, I want to see if I think they're going to do that successfully or not. So if that answers at least a piece of that question, that's a good start. My kids are trying to mess with me in the background. This is good, though. You get a sense of what I'm dealing with as a writer all the time.
This is Chewing the Gristle. We need chaos.
Oh, that's okay.
No, that's a wonderful answer. That's a real insightful answer. Bill, as our time sort of wraps up a little bit, can you tell people, our listeners, how to get a hold of your books? And,
Sure.
And when can we expect your new collection out?
Yeah, so You can use Amazon to get a hold of my stuff, but also Kelsey Books is the publisher of the first book, Estrus. So they have a site you can use. And then the new book, Unsolicited Press, I had a great experience with all the initial acceptance of that, but it is going to be a while till it's out, 2022. And when that's out, they've got a site where they sell all their stuff, and I'll have more options from there. And I think, they work with all the common Barnes & Noble, Amazon, those places too. So, yeah, I think.
Well, how about read 2 more poems for us?
So this one is called Dear Mutated Gene in My Daughter's DNA. Bang. Little atom of Cain. Insufficient sacrifice. Chipped glass. Scratched hood. I want to call you so many things, but the day gets darker and the furniture becomes pronounced. The morning shots and geneticists are too much for the insurance to bear. I was reading Rimbaud when the baby's eyes were closed, and my wife was drying her hair to the song of coos floating through the monitor. Armor-piercing bullet, peddler of cold thought, the debt of illness and love, the debt of debtors' prisons, sliver, extinguished bulb hanging in the shed, coin stuck in the machine, engineless pickup truck. Scientists know what only 4% of the universe is made of. We were almost out of money, and the physicists working on dark energy were growing less certain about their careers. One of them hanged himself from a telescope when he discovered that there will be no big crunch, that it's all spreading farther and faster away. Roots and rust, roots holding roots, net, ladder on the ground, God and the buzzards and cinder blocks. And that was one from the first book again, toward the end of the collection, which sort of moves from my experiences of my father when I was younger through my experiences as a father now. And then I'll end with one from the new collection. And this one is called Abstract Therapy in the Natural World. We were only near each other, so we took a class on trees, their dear nocturne of needles, how they pallbearer up the hills, how they tall into crashing. When does it weigh too much? The many ands, the breathing, the fear of knees and ordinary years in the kitchen. Light consoles the garden gate. We didn't take a class on trees. There's no such thing. But the end loves all beginnings. A truck of mirrors fails to clear the low bridge, and one blackbird becomes buckshot over my frozen question. No, the class was on needles. May you become your eyes was the lesson. We pulled over to see the tragedy of glass, and we were suddenly seers. The driver wasn't hurt, but was yelling, "Fuck me," at the untouched lake. A breeze steered us, and we walked among the triangles of sky, the largest organ of the earth. There were millions of us up there looking down into ourselves.
We want to thank you, Bill. This has been a wonderful opportunity for us to hear about you and your poetry and your process. And we hope it helps those who watch this video. And again, this is Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat with Al Black and Tim Conroy. And our poet today was Bill Neumire.
I appreciate it, gentlemen. Deep, deep thanks. And to everybody who's trying to become a writer out there, just remember that it's a lifestyle. It's not a career. If you start that way, you'll do fine.